Okay, so good morning. Today's daf is daf pei in Masechet Menachot. We Dove made it a little bit down into pei Amud Aleph, and so we'll start at Amar Shmuel. Let me share my screen, although I prepared a little bit before that, so if people would like, we can begin a little earlier. But in any event, we are in the eighth chapter of Menachot, which discusses the Toda offering, and the Mishnah on Ayin Tet Amabet lists three Toda-like offerings that do not require the 40 loaves to be brought with them. First is the offspring of a Toda doesn't need to have the bread brought with it. So again, you separated a female animal when it's pregnant and it now has a baby, and now the offspring ends up having a level of kedusha to it, at least according to some opinions in the Gemara, and as a result, it needs to be brought as a toda, but it doesn't. It's not a full-fledged toda, and so as a result, it doesn't get the 40 loaves with it. Or alternatively, you violated the Torah's prohibition about tamura. Tamura is the idea of substituting one animal for another. And we know that if you try to do that, both animals end up getting a level of sanctity, meaning somebody would have wanted to move the kedusha from animal A to animal B. Instead, animal A retains its level of kedusha, retains its toda status in this case, and animal B also now becomes a tamura of a toda. And what the Torah what the Mishnah told us was that tamura does not require the 40 loaves, unlike the original.
Well, we learned yesterday you cannot redeem it, right?
Yeah, there's nothing to be done. Well, I mean, when you say you can't redeem it, that's true for most korbanot. Once you've given a korban, once you've set aside a sacrifice as a sacrifice, the animal itself as a sacrifice, it cannot be redeemed. So that's not something special about a toda.
No, we learned that there certainly you can redeem certain things you can exchange for money. We learned that earlier, not recently,
No,
months.
no, no. Again, that's not true when you have an animal sacrifice. Once you've set aside animal A as a sacrifice, unless it develops a there is no possibility of moving that kedusha. Only if it develops a then you can't bring it on the altar any longer. So as a result, you're able to move its kedusha onto money and then buy a new sacrifice with it. But whether you set aside an animal as a toda, as a chatas, as a whatever it is, whatever you set aside the animal as, as long as it's capable of being brought on the altar, there's no more possibility of substitution. Um, and so that's a situation that we're dealing with. And then finally, another situation where you bring an animal in a toda-like fashion, but you do not need the loaves. That's where you lost your original animal, and then you set aside a replacement animal. Again, the original animal doesn't lose its toda-like status. And if you offer the replacement animal or the original animal, the other animal also needs to be offered like a toda, but it doesn't get offered with the 40 loaves. And so, again, we could go back a little bit if you want, in order to sort of pick up with the concept of that Rav Chanina said. You know what? Let's do that. Let's back up. We'll go back to Ayin Tedim and Bet. We got a little bit further, but we'll go over the beginning again, just for a point of Chazara. So middle of the third to last line on Ayin Tedim Bet. Shalach Rav Chanina Mishmei de Rabbi Yochanan. So Rav Chanina sent in the name of Rabbi Yochanan the following statement, the following teaching: Lo shanu el achar kapar. When we said in our Mishnah, and we're going to figure out which case we're talking about in just a moment. But when we said in our Mishnah that you don't bring the 40 additional loaves, that is only talking about after atonement has been achieved. And here, when we say atonement, we mean that some animal has been brought to fulfill your obligation in it. With respect to that animal, abalifnei kapara tu'onin lechem. But if it was before the atonement was was made, meaning that the animal was brought in a successful manner. In this case, we're talking about as a toda, that the toda was brought successfully. If it's before a toda was brought, then you would still require bread. Now, Rashi tells us, lo shanu, and again, Rashi, 1, 2, 3, 5 lines, 4 lines into the wide lines of Rashi. And when I say Rashi, we mean the Rashi at the top part of the page, as opposed to the Kisvei Yad. I'll note that we're going to go to both of them. We're going to utilize both of them as resources as we continue. So lo shanu haditanan lo vlados that when we said in our Mishnah that the children and the exchanged animals do not require bread, ella achar kapara. That is referring to after, continuing on with the next Rashi, that is after the atonement. La achar shenis kaper be'achas mehem. After you've gotten some level of atonement through one of the animals. She'im hikrib shuv la'acheret that once you brought one animal with the bread, then you don't have to bring the other animal without then you can bring the other animals without the bread. But if you haven't yet brought one animal with the bread, well, then you'd have to bring this animal with the bread. So Habiba, Rav Avram was wondering, ahai, what case are we talking about? Meaning, what's the nature of the obligation to bring this toda? Ilema achalifa todas chova. If you were talking about an animal that was a replacement for an obligatory toda, and Rashi now will take advantage of the Rashi ksiv yad, 1, 2, 3, 5 lines from the bottom of the daf. A little bit into the line. Ilema achalifa toda chova kigon de amar, like somebody says, Harei alai. Behold, I am taking on the obligation. And so if you use that language, then if God forbid something happens to the initial animal that you set aside, because you said that the obligation is on you, and not just that this animal was going to be your sacrifice, but you yourself obligated yourself, well then, the hifrish behema, and now you separated an animal, we say that you are liable for you're responsible for whatever happens to it.
Isn't that a netter? Is that a form of a netter?
Yeah, it's a form of a neder. Exactly. Thank you for using that language. That's exactly right. It's a form of a neder. Daha omer alai, that somebody who said that it's on me, va'avda, and now it gets lost, v'hifrish acheret, and now you separated a new one, v'nimtses harishona, and you find the first one, as we now continue on the fourth to last line in Rashi ksiv yad, the ka'amar im kodem shehikriv, and so what we say is, if it was before the first one was shehikriv harishona, if it was before the first one was brought, hikriv shnina to una lechem. Well, then the second one will require bread. Hashniya, the second one will require bread. Ve'im lo. Well, then pshita. If you're going to tell me that that's what it means, that's kind of obvious. As we continue back into the Gemara, so ilifnei. Right, so this is last line, 1, 2, 3, 5 words into the line. Ilifnei kapara tanina. If you tell me that what Rav Chanina is saying in the name of Rabbi Yochanan is about a chalife todas chova, well, that was what we learned in the brisa just before this in the initial Gemara on this Mishnah. Ein la'achar and la'achar kapara tanina, and if it's after kapara that you don't need to bring it, that also we learned. Because what did that brisa say? The brisa specifically said that when you that if you obligated yourself to bring in toda, and you lost the initial one, and now you found it, and then you set aside, I'm sorry, before you found it, you set aside a new one. So you have both animals, and then you find the original. So now you have both animals A and B in front of you. And we say specifically that you can bring, that says she'eza mehen sheyirtza yakriv v'lachma ima, that you can bring whichever one you want, and you bring the bread with it. So that and obviously once you brought one of them, the other one doesn't require the bread. So that was explicit in the brisa that we just learned. So clearly that can't be the point that Rav Chanina is saying in the name of Rabbi Yochanan as we turn to Pei Amud Aleph. Ella achaliva toda nivdava. All right, so you know what? Maybe we're talking about where it's a replacement for a voluntary toda. Now, when we say a toda nidava, what we mean is, and Rashi Ksiv Yad helps us out. First Rashi Ksiv Yad on Pei Amud Aleph, so it's bottom part of the page, but top within the Ksiv Yad. Ella achalubi toda nidava kigon to Amar hare zu toda. Right, the person says this animal is going to be my toda. And so as a result, you're not responsible for its replacement if anything happens. Va'avda, and then it did get lost. The hifrish hakeres, and now you set up a new one. Well, that's going to that can't be what we're talking about, because bein lifnei kapara, bein la'achar kapara to unos lechem. In that situation, you didn't have to set up the second one, and so as a result, when you did set up the second one is a full-fledged toda. It's not a replacement toda, and so as a result, marba betodosu, he's just simply adding to the number of sacrifices, as Rashi Ksiv Yad says. Second line in the Rashi Ksiv Yad, Marba betodos who v'lav chalibin he. It's not a replacement. It's not a switcheroo. Because you weren't responsible for replacing it when it got lost. Kamaisa, the first one, Ela toda ba'apinavsha he. It's its own sacrifice. The te'una lechem, and therefore it would require bread. Afilunis kapar birishona, even if you did get kapara with the first one. So
you have to bring 80 loaves of bread, 40
yeah,
for this,
you'd have to
40 for
bring
this.
absolutely. You'd bring 80 loaves of bread, 40 for the first one, 40 for the second one. So that can't be what we're talking about. So we go to our third possibility. Ella avlad toda nadava. What we're talking about is the following situation. The child of a Nadava. So again, I say that Bessie, my cow, is going to be a Toda. And I don't obligate myself. I just say Bessie. But Bessie turns out to have been pregnant. And so as a result, now the baby is also going to be a Toda. And so as a result, maybe that's the situation. And again, remember, our Mishnah said that the baby of a Toda is offered as a toda, but without the bread. So bein lifnei kapara, bein la'achar kapara, ain't tunin lechem. But one second, in that situation, it doesn't make a difference whether you already offered Bessie, whether I already offered Bessie or not. In both situations, the baby is not going to require bread, because our Mishnah said it didn't require bread. Moser de todahi. It is a residual toda. It's a leftover toda. It's an additional toda where there's a special rule. And take a look at Rashi. Now we'll go back to Rashi in the top of the page.
So
now
the baby is automatically mukdash?
Well, it's a debate within the Gemara, and we will see a little bit of that debate later today, but or over the next couple of days. But yes, basically under this understanding, absolutely, it is sanctified and would require. Let's take a look on the third line of Rashi, third narrow line of Rashi at the top of Pei Amud Aleph. Ella avlad toda nadava. So kigon shehifrish v'yalda. You set aside Bessie, and then it had a baby. So Bain, and take a look at the letter Aleph. The Aleph there says Bain. It's really taking out the word hakriva. Bain lifnei kapara, Bain la'achar kapara, ain tu'una lechem. It's not going to require bread. Demoser de todahi. It is an extra toda. It is a leftover or residual aspect of the toda. Shekvarnis kaper ba'acher, because you are already going to get atonement through something else, through the mother. V'havi kemafrish mos l'toda. So it's just like a case where I set aside $1,000 for a toda, but then I end up buying a toda for $800. The $200 extra dollars are extra. V'nitotro, and there's leftover money. To kol davar haba me'alav, that everything could go in Vlad chashiv moser, that everything that sort of comes of its own, meaning it never got its kedusha directly or primarily, it ends up being a leftover. And as a result, the leftover responsibility is that it gets treated like um, toda, but it doesn't have a requirement for the bread. So that can't be our case either.
How are we defining kapara here? Well, what is the
It's
actual act of kapara?
bringing the toda that you said you were going to bring.
But is that until the point of shchita or after shchita or
Oh, it's not only after shkita; it's presumably after all aspects of the toda were brought correctly. So ella avlad toda chova. So
what's the distinction in between bain uh lifnei kapara acharei kapara? Once
so
you brought
the point is that the question is right. The statement of Rav Chanina in the name of Rav Yochanan was that if you haven't yet brought the original animal, or on some level, if you haven't yet gotten atonement for your initial obligation to give a toda, then even if it's the replacement that you're bringing, it will require 40 loaves. That's the statement that Rav Chanina said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. And what we haven't yet been able to do so far is figure out what it's talking about that would be some sort of chiddush. At the moment, the closest thing that we've got is it's really just telling us exactly what we already saw in our Mishnah. And so as a result, we're now getting to the fourth and final of the possibilities, and that's going to be the one that we're going to say is correct. And now I've scrolled it to the top of the screen, and so that's going to be our case. So Ella Avlad Todachova. It's got to be where you obligated yourself to bring a toda, and so you use the language of hare alai, that I'm going to make myself an obligation, and that you're going to bring a toda. And now the animal, now you decide, well, to fulfill that obligation, you set aside Bessie, and Bessie then has a baby. And so, lifnei kapara ta'un lechem, before you bring Bessie, this baby would require bread, and la'achar kapara ein ta'un lechem, and afterwards it would not require bread. And that's what we're teaching us, that specifically, whereas if it's a voluntary obligation and you just set aside Bessie as the animal, and Bessie then has the baby, well, then that baby, although it has the kedusha of a toda, you can never offer it as the primary animal. Even if you were to offer it first, it would not require the 40 loaves. What we're teaching here, what Rabbi Yochanan is saying, is that when you have the animal that when the obligation is on the person, and the person sets aside Bessie, and now Bessie has the baby. Now, if you were to bring the baby before Bessie, you would bring it with the 40 loaves and it would fulfill your obligation. And then it would be Bessie that you would no longer have to bring 40 loaves for. And so that's what it's teaching us. So, my Kamash Malan, what is that? What's the point of this lesson? And the point of this lesson is a fundamental principle, to Kasava Rabbi Yochanan, Adam Miskaper B'Shvach Hektish. That Rabbi Yochanan says that when you have an obligation on you, and you have responsibility for Bessie, and Bessie has a baby, that baby has full-fledged kedusha. It could be offered as your primary sacrifice, because when you set aside Bessie, it was pregnant. In the end, we're going to understand that it means that it was pregnant, and you knew that it was pregnant, and you essentially, intentionally, what you effectively mean is I'm going to bring either Bessie or the baby as my sacrifice. And that's effectively what you mean. So, and Habiba, Nami Abaye Kihait Gavna, that you know what? Abaye taught that was exactly what Rabbi Yochanan meant as well. And Itmar Nami, in fact, we actually found a statement in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that says exactly this same point.
could it be that the baby was that one didn't know it was pregnant, and then before one sacrificed it, brought it, then it delivered the baby, and
So
so not
then we would probably, then Rabbi Yochanan would presumably say you didn't know about it, so you couldn't have had in mind for it, and so therefore it would just be a moser. It would be just like the case of the Vlad Nidava. the if it was just you
Or if
just
the
said
baby, or if the mother became pregnant after,
correct. In
well,
both of
then
those
don't.
cases, it would not this ruling would not apply, it seems.
It seems,
So
but Dove said otherwise yesterday. He seemed to say that it didn't matter as long as the mother
we'll see.
was pregnant
We'll see
before
over the
at
coming
some point.
we'll see over the coming few days that's there's a reason that I say what I'm saying that that it must be that we'll do a Rashi or I believe that will make it clearer that it seems at least according to Rashi I believe that it has to be that you knew about it and we'll see that again. He may not have done the next couple of days, in which case I would have might have thought the same thing as him. But I believe that based on what we've seen, what I've seen in the couple of coming days, I'm pretty sure that it means that you knew that it was pregnant, and if you didn't know that it was pregnant, it would be more like it would just be a Moser Toda. But in any event, let's say that Itmar Nami, we're going to now see a statement by Rabbi Yitzchak in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that says exactly what we just explained. So Itmar Nami, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Chilufe Toda Nedava, if it is a switcheroo associated with a nadava, meaning that you said Bessie was going to be your toda, you don't have any responsibility for it. Bein lifnei kapara, bein la'achar kapara to unalechem. Then it doesn't make a difference whether you offered it before or after. It's going to require the bread. Marba betodosu. The point is that you are essentially adding a toda. The point is, I'm sorry, this is chalufe, right? So this is the switcheroo case, and you didn't need to switcheroo. You had no obligation. You had no responsibility. So when you tried to do the switcheroo, you were just offering an additional toda, and therefore it's going to require the bread. Vlad todas nadava. If it was a child of a voluntary offering. So now Bessie had the baby. So bein lifnei kapara, bein la'achar kapara, ein ton lechem. Well, then it doesn't make a difference whether it was before or after you brought Bessie. The baby isn't going to require any loaves because moser de todahu. It's the leftover, it's the residual toda, it's the extra money that you set aside, and therefore it only has the kedusha of a toda, but isn't a separate toda itself.
Well,
Vlad
what is
told
this case? That's the Vlad Nadava.
that's the Vlad Nadava, exactly. So, but the case, and now we get to the case where we just the proof Vlad Toda Chova. But if it's the child of an obligatory offering, meaning where you say I'm going to be responsible for it, well then lefnei kapara. If it's before you brought the original animal to unin lechem, it requires the bread. La'achar kapara ain't unin lechem. But after atonement, it does not require the bread. Okay, and so now
And that's
we
the
have
Vlad requires the bread. The Vlad.
yes, if it's after atonement, the vlad does not require the bread. That's exactly right. The vlad, either if it's before atonement, the vlad does require the bread because effectively the vlad becomes your main sacrifice. And if it's after atonement, meaning after you've brought Bessie, well, then the child does no longer require bread because then it effectively becomes a Moser Toda situation.
But the mother does not require the bread, right?
Well, the mother requires the bread if you bring the mother first, and the mother does not require the bread if you bring the mother second. Whichever you bring first is going to require the bread because that's going to be the fulfillment of your obligation.
Well, in this case, there are not the one doesn't bring the bread twice. One only brings 40,
Correct.
not.
Correct. The situation where you bring the bread twice is if it was a chilufe toda nedava as opposed to a vlad toda nedava. Chilufe meaning you lost the original one and you brought another one, but you weren't responsible to bring another one. So your second one, because you weren't responsible, is a full-fledged toda which requires its own bread. But otherwise, only one of the animals is going to require the bread. If it's a Vlad Toda Nedava, it's going to be only the mother. If it's a Vlad Toda Chova, it's going to be whichever you bring first. So that's the bottom line. And again, that is Rabbi Yochanan's opinion. We are going to see an opinion that disagrees with Rabbi Yochanan in a little while. Amar Shmuel. So now we have Shmuel makes a similar statement in connecting certain chatas situations to certain toda situations. Amar Shmuel. Kol shebachatas mesa, anytime a sin offering would be left to die, Bitoda ain't tuna lechem. When in a toda situation, you're not going to be required to bring bread because essentially the you've already the situation where the chatas is going to be left to die. There is no further atonement associated with that situation, and therefore, in a situation with respect to a toda, it doesn't require bread and kol shebechatas roeh, and wherever the chatas animal is left to graze, betoda teuna lechem. In a toda situation, it would require bread. So Masav Rav Amram wondered, 1 second, I don't think that's true. What about the following Brisa and Mishnah, which seem to suggest the Brisa is going to note that if a toda is lost and replaced, it does not require bread, while the Mishnah is going to imply that a chatat in a similar situation would be left to graze and not to die. And so that's inconsistent because you said every time that something's going to be left to graze and not to die, it's supposed to require bread. But we're going to say that it doesn't require bread. So let's take a look. So Mao Omer HaTorah, excuse me, Mahu Omer Hatoda Yakriv. The Torah says Hatoda Yakriv. Now the pasuk actually says Yakrivenu. It says V'im al Toda Yakrivenu v'hikriv al Zevach Hatoda Chalov Matzot, etc., etc. This is Parak Zayin pasuk Yud Bet of Vayikra. This past week's Torah portion. So why does it say? But it's emphasizing the first part of the word. We're going to end up using the Yakrivenu at the end of this brisa, but right now it's just focused on the first part of the word. So Minayim, how do I know that lemafrish toda so v'avda v'hifrish acheres tachta v'nimtzas harishona v'harei shteim omdos minayin she'eza mehen sheyirtze Yakriv v'lach ma'ima? How do I know that if I set aside toda number 1 and then I lose it, and now I set aside toda number 2, and then I find toda number 1, that I have the ability to choose whichever one I want to bring, and I would bring bread with that one? How do I know that? Talmud Lomer HaToda Yakriv. That's why the Torah says the Toda you're going to bring. So Yachol Tehei Shniya Te'una Lechem. Now 1 second, maybe I might think that the second one would also require bread. So Talmud Lomer Yakrivenu. That's why it doesn't say Hatoda Yakriv. It actually says Yakrivenu. It, meaning singular. Yakrivenu is that he is going to offer it. Echad v'lo shnayim. He's offering 1, not 2. V'ilu gabi chatas ki hai gavna roa. Now 1 second. So we just saw that when it came to this situation, that you are not required to bring bread with the second animal. But the ilu gabi chatas ki hai gavna roa. But in the same situation, where if you had 1 chatas and then you lost it, and then you set aside another one, and now you found it, the original one. So you have chatas A and B in front of you. We say that you offer one of them and the other one is left to graze. Well, if you're supposed to leave it to graze, according to the statement of Shmuel, you're supposed to have to bring bread with it. Ditzanan, because we learned in a Mishnah. Hifrish chatasova avda. The hifish acheres tachteha v'nimtzas harishona v'harei shteim omdos miskaper ba'achas mehen ushnias tamus. But we said in a Mishnah that if you set aside 1 chatas and you lose it, and you set aside another one, and then you find the original, and now both of them are before you, you can choose one of them to use for your kapara, for your atonement, for your chatas offering, and the second one dies. Divrei Rebbe. Now that's what Rebbe says. But b'chachamim omrim ein chatas mesa. The second one does not die. It actually ella nimtzis la'akar shenis kapru balim. Only the second one will only die if the first one was already brought. Meaning, if the replacement was already brought. So again, according to the Chachamim, you set aside A as a chatas, you lose A, and you set aside B as a chatas. And now you bring B as a chatas, and now A is found after you brought B. Well, then the Chachamim agree with Rebbe that when you found A needs to die, and you set it aside, and you put it in a room, and you don't feed it, and it dies. So
Can't just let it graze?
no, you can't just let it graze. These are it's a that it is effectively it's too late for the animal. So that's this. That's what where Chachamim agree with Rebbe, but the Chachamim disagree with Rebbe in the case where if you set aside A, now you lose A, you set aside B, but now before you bring B, you find A, and so now in front of you are both A and B. In that situation, when you are choosing to bring one of them, the other one we allow you to graze. That's what the Chachamim say. And yet, in that same situation, again, Shmuel says that when you allow to graze in a chata situation, in a toda situation, you're supposed to require the bread. But here, in the same Toda situation, you're not required to bring the bread. Instead, we say you don't have to bring the bread. So this is a contradiction to Shmuel's statement.
Why
So
would there be a hava? I mean, he would bring bread. If he lets it graze, he's not going to bring that korban, right?
no, remember that we're dealing with two situations.
I
In
understand
one,
that, but we're talking about where
One's a
in this.
chatas, one's a toda. In the toda situation, you're not letting it graze. It's the chatas that you let graze. In the same situation in the toda, you bring the animal as a sacrifice.
Oh, okay. All right.
So you
Right.
bring the animal as a sacrifice, and you would bring the 40
Right.
breads
Okay.
with it. That's
Okay.
what Shmuel's saying. And the point is that Shmuel's statement seems to directly contradict the Mishnah, because we have a Mishnah that says that according to the Chachamim, and presumably Shmuel is holding like the Chachamim, and we're going to reject that in just a second, and therefore Shmuel is holding like the Chachamim, and the Chachamim say that you let it to graze, but in the same situation, we said you don't require the 40 loaves. So how can that be? So the answer is, as I just highlighted, Shmuel Karebi Svira, that Shmuel holds like Rebbe, where 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. 16 lines up. First word on the line is Sphirale. First words on the line of Sphirale on Pei Amid Aleph. And so as a result, the Amar, Avuda b'shas hafrasha mesa, that in the one that's lost at the time that you separate. The second one is it's going to die if you find even if you find the original before the second one is offered. And so as a result, that there's one of them is definitely going to die. And that's because Shmuel is like Rebbe. And again, Rebbe said that the one is atoned with, and the other one is going to be left to die. But Ela Roa Rebbe Hechi Mishkachasla. So, okay. So, according to Rebbe, then what is the situation? Remember, Shmuel said two statements that when a chatas would be left to die, the toda doesn't require the bread. We're now consistent on that front because the case of the switcheroo, the case of losing A and then setting aside B and then finding A is correct. That and when it comes to a chatas, we leave it to die, and in the case of the toda, we bring it, but we don't require bread. So that is exactly what Shmuel said. But Shmuel had a second statement. He said that whenever there's a chatas that is left to graze, in a Toda situation, we're supposed to require bread. Where is that situation? So, Kidda Rebbe Oshia must be the situation that Rebbe Oshia says. Da'amar Rebbe Oshia, hifrishtei chatos lachrayas. If you set aside two sin offerings, one only you're only obligated with one chatas, but you decide, you know what, I'm very nervous that something bad will happen to the first one, so I'm setting aside both of them, two of them, and the second one is just in case anything happens to the first one. So what happens in that situation? After you bring the first one, the second one is going to be Da'am Rabbi Oshia, if you set aside the second one just in case, Miskaber Be'ezim Mehen Yashir. So you can use whichever one you want, and you let the second one graze. And
Doesn't he have
so
achrayut on both of them, though?
Well, again, no. The situation is the following. God forbid, John Doe did a sin in which he's obligated in a chatas. Now he's very nervous. He wants to make sure his chatas happens. So he sets aside both animals A and B. and he says, you know what? I only am obligated in one chatas, but I want to set aside both, and I'm going to bring both to Yerushalayim just in case something happens along the way. Well, nothing happens. Thank God, nothing happens. And so as a result, he now has both animals. He chooses one of them to be a sin offering. The second one is left to graze, and he's going to end up then selling, using that money to bring olot offerings. That's the law according to Rabbi Oshia. But now,
So is he essentially redeemed it or not redeemed it then?
well, effectively, because it will be a redemption, but it's a redemption that happens only after it develops a mum, because he can't bring it as a sin offering because he didn't have a second sin. So so that's the situation. So he's going to allow that offering to graze, and now he brings, and then he's going to. But the bottom line is what we said according to Shmuel. Remember, the whole point of this is analyzing Shmuel's statement, and Shmuel says that when we allow something to graze in the same situation, we would say that a toda requires bread. But v'hagabi toda ki hai gavna ein tun alechem. But the Gemara asks, 1 second, in that situation, there would not be a requirement for bread. Ela Shmuel karebi Shimon tzvirle. So as a result, you know what? Shmuel is not even thinking like Rebbe. Rather, he agrees with Rebbe Shimon. To Amar chamesh chatos mesos. That there are 5 situations where the animal is left to die. And those 5 situations are as follows. In fact, we can do Rashi.
We learned some of this before, right? One is where the Baal dies, and one is
Correct. We've seen it over time. In fact, and Rashi goes through all 5 situations for us. So it's in Rashi, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 21 or 22 lines up. Ella Karebi Shimon. Ella is the last word on the line. Karebi Shimon is the first word. To Amar Chamesh Chataos Maitot. That there are 5 situations where the sin offering dies. Vlad Chatas, the child of a Chatas, that one is going to automatically die. Tamuras Chatas, if you say, I want to move the Chatas from animal 1 to animal 2, both of them become chataot, and the second one effectively is going to be left to die. V'chatas shemesu ba'aleha, and a chatas where the owner dies, so the owner has died, so there's no longer a requirement for atonement, and so as a result, the animal is left to die. V'sheskapru ba'aleha be'acher, and the case that's relevant to us is where the owner receives atonement from another one. V'she'ibra shnata, and the 5th case is where you're supposed to bring it when it's under 1 year old, and it becomes 2 years old, and so as a result, and it comes into the 2nd year, and so as a result,
too long.
You waited too long. Exactly, you waited too long to bring it, and so as a result, in all 5 of those situations, the animal is left to die. So 1 second though, but that means Baharo el Rebbe Shimon leisleg klal. There is no situation according to Rebbe Shimon where there's grazing. So how could we say that Shmuel is like Rebbe Shimon and made the statement of kol shebechatas roeh, that whenever a sin offering would be left to graze, betoda tun alechem, that in the bread in the toda case it would require bread. There is no situation like that. So Shmuel Namichadikamer. So we answer that, you know what? Our original statement of Shmuel was not actually what he said. All he said was Kol shebechatas mesa betoda ein te'una lechem. That whenever you have a situation where a chatas is left to die, the toda does not require bread. So my kamash malan, what's the big deal about that? Pretty much everybody agrees to the basic concepts. So la'apukim into Rabbi Yochanan. It is specifically that he's disagreeing with Rabbi Yochanan that we saw before. Remember, Rabbi Yochanan said that if you set aside a pregnant animal as to fulfill your obligation to bring a toda, and then the animal has the baby, you can bring the baby as your main toda with the bread. But what Shmuel is saying, because remember, Shmuel's statement about saying that whenever a chatas would be left to die, you don't bring the bread. Well, what is one of the cases where a chatas would be left to die? Is the baby of a chatas. You set aside an animal when it was pregnant and it has a baby. That baby is going to be left to die. So la puki mid Rabbi Yochanan da amar adam miskaper b'shvach hektish. Rabbi Yochanan says that you can achieve atonement, meaning your original Toda can be even through the baby. Kamash Malan Delo, Shmuel is telling us that no, the offspring of a chatas is left to die, so as a result, there's no bread for the baby of a Toda either, even in the situation where Rabbi Yochanan would say that yes, you could bring the baby instead of the mother and fulfill your full obligation.
That was a chova. Didn't they say that was a Vlad
Correct.
chova?
That's a Vlad Chova. Exactly. That in that Vlad Chova situation, so that's the basics of the disagreement between Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says that in a Vlad Chova, you can bring the Vlad with bread before you bring the mother and fulfill your full obligation. And Shmuel says, no, you absolutely cannot. So Rabbi Abba, Zo Toda Vizo Lachma. If you say, so now the Gemara notes a distinction between the bread set aside as an adava and an animal set aside as an adava. There's a big and important difference. Rabbi Abba, Zo Toda Vizo Lachma. If I say this is the bread and this is the Toda and this is the bread, Abba Lechem, maybe Lechem Acher. If even though this is a total voluntary situation, you said this is the bread and this is the sacrifice. Even though you lost the bread, if you lost the sacrifice, we're going to see that you don't have to do anything. But if you lose just the bread, you're going to have to bring other bread of the Toda. But if you lose the Toda, any maybe Toda Acheret, you don't have to bring another one. Why? My timer. What's the reason for the distinction? After all, I might have thought that once you lose any part of it, maybe you don't have an obligation because you said this is the bread and this is the Toda. Or this is the Toda and this is the bread. Lechem liglal Toda. The bread comes along with the Toda. The ain't Toda liglal lechem. But the Toda is not coming along with the bread, meaning that which is primary and which is secondary. The primary is the animal. And so as a result, if the animal gets lost, well, then your whole obligation goes away. But if the animal doesn't get lost and you just lose the bread, you need to fulfill your obligation on the animal, which you still have, and therefore you need to bring other bread. Amarava. Now this is
How does that explain the situation if they recover the animal? You have two of them then.
Yes. Well, remember. Yes. First of all, this is a zoo, hare zoo case, and so as a result, if you did set aside a second animal as a korban, it would require its own 40 loaves. Remember, that's the case.
Right.
Right. So if that's what you're saying, absolutely. You're absolutely right. Okay, so Amarava, and the Masoras Shas takes out the Vav in front of it. Hifrish Maos Latodaso. What if the situation is very similar, but you're talking about money? So you set aside money for a Toda, and you set aside $1,000 to buy the animal, the no tro, and you end up with a couple bucks left over. Maybe vehen lechem. You can use the leftover money to buy the bread that's associated with it. Lachme Toda v'notratro, but now you set aside a couple $100 for bread because it's a lot of bread that you got to buy. And you have a couple bucks left over. Ein mive behen b'toda. You cannot use the Toda leftover money to bring the Toda. So my timer, what's the reason? Now, because why can you go only in one direction? So Elim Mishum to Rav Kahana, maybe it's because of Rav Kahana to Amar Rav Kahana Minayan Lulachma Toda Shenikru Toda. How do I know that the bread that's associated with the Toda is called itself the Toda offering? Shenemar vehikriv al zevach hatoda chalot matzot, that you should bring with the zevach Toda loaves of matzah. Now the juxtaposition, the Torah didn't need to have the word Toda next to chalot. The fact that it is next to chalot tells us that the chalot are the Toda. Well, meaning once you tell me that the chalot are the Toda and the Toda is the Toda, well then you should be able to go in any direction. You should be able to use leftover Toda money for bread, and you should be able to use leftover bread money for Toda. No, Lechem ikri toda. The bread is called a toda, but the toda lo ikri lechem. But the toda itself is not called bread, and therefore, when you set aside money for the bread of the toda, it cannot be used for the toda itself.
So here the
Okay.
toda means the animal, right?
Yes, the toda means the animal. Correct. The Amar Rava, Rava has another statement. Hifrish toda so va'avda. If you had set aside a toda and you got lost, and now you set aside another one. So you have animal A, and now you had animal B. And it also gets lost. And now you set aside animal C. The nimtzu harishonos v'harei shlashtan omdos. We now found the third one. Now we found the first two, and so now we have A, B, and C are all right here in front of us. And if this sounds, by the way, if this sounds familiar, you're right because we saw this Gemara back a couple of months ago at this point, back on Daf Tesvav Amud Aleph. Very similar Gemara. So
So as like you were saying before, this fellow goes to the Beit HaMikdash, goes to Yerushalayim, and he brings two of them. One is insurance. Maybe I don't. It could something
well,
happens along the way, and
well,
nothing happens. But suppose something happens to both of them, and he has to find a third one.
correct. So correct. So that's exactly what happened. So he said that he was obligated in a toda. He lost A. He lost B. And so he set aside C, and now he found A and B. So the question is what happens if he brings one of them? What happens to the other ones? Again, the other ones, if they are considered an exchange, then they are brought without the bread. But if they're not considered an exchange, if they're considered a separate animal, a separate toda, then it would require bread. So nimtzu harishonos v'harei shlashtan omdos. So now we've got three of them in front of them. Niskapa b'rishona. If he uses A as his animal, shnia ein tuna lechem. The second one, B, is not going to require bread because it is a replacement for A. But the third animal, C, tuna lechem, will require bread because unlike B, which was a replacement for A, C was only a replacement for B. It was not a replacement directly for A. And so therefore, even though C on some level was an indirect replacement for A, it does not have, it was never brought with bread, and therefore C would be required to be brought with bread on its own. Rashi says it very nicely. Fourth line in Rashi on Peyam Bet. Shlishi tuna lechem. Dulo hav yechalife toda rishona. Because it is not an exchanged animal for the first, for animal A. Umar b'todasu. And so as a result, he's just offering extra toda. Even though he was obligated to, he obligated himself, and so that's why he set it aside. Because he set aside another one. Nonetheless, Amrina and Haka, we say in this case, Vadai Shlishas lo havya ella marba betodos. This is just an extra toda to lo havya chalipa that isn't an exchange and therefore would need to be brought.
Now this could go on forever. He could have 10
Yes,
of them,
correct,
20 of
correct,
them,
correct.
100 of them. He
That's
loses all,
exactly
he
right.
loses 99 of them.
Correct. That's
Then
exactly
he
right.
recovers them in the whole farm.
That's exactly right. So niskaper b'shlishis. If, on the other hand, he does a kapara with the third one, he chooses to use animal C. Shniya ain't tuna lechem. The second one doesn't require the bread because C was an exchange for B, and so as a result, B won't require it. But Rishona tuna lechem. But the first one would, and so as a result, he would again require 80 loaves, 40 with A, 40 with C. And B would be brought without any loaves. Be'emtsa'it. However, if he's really smart and he chooses animal B, shtein ein tunas lechem. The other two won't require bread. Why won't the other two require bread? Because C was an exchange for B, and so as a result, C won't require bread because you're bringing bread with B. And B was an exchange for A, so as a result, since you're bringing B with bread, A won't require bread. So if you're really smart and you don't want to bring the extra bread, you bring B with bread, and then you bring A and C without bread.
It saves a lot of money.
Correct. Abaye says, what are you talking about, Rava? This is all whatever one you choose, the other two are all part of the same list. Kulu chalipin da. They're all exchanges. Now, interesting thing is that we don't paskin like Abaye, even though I think Abaye makes more sense here. But in any event, they are not all. We don't paskin like Abaye, and then we say no. You focus on the narrow situation. So Amar Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera says v'chein le'inyan chatas. Chataos. The same rule applies to sin offerings. Hifrish chatas va'avda. V'hifrish tacheres takta va'avda. Hifrish tacheres takta. V'nimtzu harishonos v'harei shloshtan ondos. So again, we had A, B, and C. You lost A. I mean, you're setting them all up as chataot now, not as todaot, but as todot. But here we're setting them as sin offerings. And so as a result, we had A, then we had B, then we had C, and now we found A and B. And so as a result, we have all three in front of us. Niskaber brishona. If you do the first one, shnia tamut shlishis tireh. The second one will die, and the third one gets to graze. Now this is very consistent with the concept that we had by Shmuel of the fact that whenever it would graze, it would also get the bread. But in any event, this kapar b'shlishis shnia tamut. And if you do the third one, the second one is going to die. V'rishona tireh, and the first one is going to graze. Again, the basic idea is that if it's the substitute, then it has to die because you already received atonement for it. But if it's not a substitute and it's just extra, well, then you leave it to graze. This kapar be'emsa'id. However, if you were to use the middle one, the B as the atonement, shteim yamusu, well, then everyone that's left is going to die. Abaye Amar, afilin is kapar be'achad, man. Doesn't make a difference which one you use. Shteim yamutu, the other two will die. Kulu chalivin da dadininu. They're all part of the same exchange. So the Gemara wonders, my v'chein, what are you saying? And similarly, meaning, of course, it's the same rule. Why would you think anything differently? So Maudatema, no, I might have thought that there's a different law. Hasam hu de ikalamemer marba betodas who, that why can we say that you're just adding to the todas because you can just add to todas, meaning you have the ability to offer multiple todas. Aval hacha de lekalamemer marba b'chatos he, who you can't say that the person is just adding an extra chatas, amalo. Maybe I would say that all the other two have to die, meaning that I would agree with Rabbah that they're all considered substitutes. So Kamash Malan, that's why Rabbi Zera needs to tell us that the same rule applies to chataot as it applies to the todas.
And what's his
Oh,
opinion? What's Rabbi Zera's opinion then?
Rabbi Zera's opinion is exactly like Rava, that essentially that if you bring B as your sin offering, well then A and C need to die. But if you bring A as your sin offering, B needs to die, but C would have to graze. And if you bring C as your sin offering, B would have to die still, but A would be left to graze. And that is just like that again, just as in situation, whenever you have a situation where the animal would require the 40 loaves, well then in a sin offering situation, it's going to be left to graze. And whenever there's no 40 loaves in a sin offering situation, it would be left to die.
It seems like it is. I mean, the way I'm looking at it from afar, there's a little bit of inconsistency. Why? Because if one doesn't have to bring the 40 loaves, like Abai said this, if you choose the MCE, doesn't have to bring the 40 loaves for the other two, right? That's
Well,
what. So
that's a situation where Baye agrees with Rava. Rava is the one who says
yeah,
that sometimes.
okay.
Okay, but
So
anyway, go ahead.
if that's the case, then Abai and Rava, then that's a measure of leniency. Abai and Rava,
Yes, in the
it's a
odd
measure of
situation,
leniency on
it
the Baal. They say, listen, we're not going
correct.
to obligate you to spend so much money. And then the next, but as a
But in a sin
corollary,
offering,
as a
100%.
corollary, I would say by the chatot, then a leniency on the part of the animal would be allowed them to graze, not to force them
Yes,
to die.
a
And
hundred
so
percent.
that's why I see some inconsistency. You want to be lenient, you want to get some
It
compassion, to be compassionate. One, for the Baal, who doesn't have to pay as much, and two, in this situation, for the animals, let them live, let them graze.
Correct. And that highlights the fact that this is not about a leniency, but rather about the nature of the fulfillment of one's obligation. And in a situation where there is no obligation left to possibly be fulfilled in connection with an animal, that the same obligation that was on that animal has now been fulfilled otherwise. So then in that situation, that's the situation where you don't have to bring 40 and you leave the animal to die. And so as a result, you're absolutely right. It is inconsistent from the perspective of leniency,
And
but it is
compassion.
and compassion. You're right. It's inconsistent, but it's consistent in the question of, does this animal do anything for the owner? And if the animal doesn't do anything for the owner, well, then in the situation of a sin offering, we can't offer it. And so as a result, it must die. But in a situation where it's considered like an extra, like you set aside too much money, then in that situation, and isn't as if it was direct, the obligation was directly fulfilled, well, then in the situation of a toda, well, then it's like an extra toda and will require you to bring the loaves. And in the situation where it's a sin offering, we're going to say, you know what? You can't bring it as a sin offering because you can't bring extra sin offerings. But in that situation, we'll allow you to let it to graze and will allow you to fulfill a different obligation and bring it as an ola. So, and bring the money, use the money for an ola. So you're absolutely right that from a leniency perspective, you're correct. It is not consistent. Okay, so the Gemara now quotes a brisa in the name of Rabbi Chia, addressing a case of a toda mixed with its tamura, and we're going to use this as a basis to sort of then introduce an interesting topic that we'll go into, God willing, tomorrow. So Tani Rabbi Chia, toda shenis arva b'tamura sa. If you have a toda that got switched up with its tamura. So again, you had animal A, that was a toda, and you said, you know what? I like animal B better. Let's move this toda and make animal B the toda. The problem is that doesn't work. So now both animal A and animal B are todas. And as we saw in our Mishnah, animal A would be brought with the 40 loaves, but animal B as the tamura would not be brought with the 40 loaves. But now you got animal B and A mixed up. And so you don't know which one it is. And one of them now died. So, chaverta ein umeta achat mehen. One of them died. Chaverta ein la takana. There is no way to fix the problem. Hechinevad. After all, what could he do? Nakriv lehem bahada. If he's going to nakriv lechem bahada, is he going to offer it with bread? Dilma tamurahi. Maybe what's left, the animal that survived, is the tamura, and you're supposed to bring it without bread. Lo nakriv lechem bahada, or you're going to not bring bread with it. Well, dilma todahi, and maybe it is the real toda, and therefore you need to bring bread. So hechidami, what's the case that we're going to talk about? Da'amar Allah, da'amar Allah, if he's personally obligated, lo sagya de lo mighty la behema achrina velechem velema. So that one second, if in fact he says I'm obligated, so then it's not going to be sufficient. There's no way we could let him get away without bringing an animal. So we're going to tell him to bring an animal, velema, and he should say the following: ihachta kaima tamurahi. If the one that's in front of me now is the tamura, well, ha toda halachma. Well, then this is the replacement toda for the toda that I'm obligated, and this is the bread for the toda that I'm obligated. And hak dekaima todahi, if the first one is a toda, meaning if the one that's left over and that survived is a toda, halachma, this is the bread for that toda. Vaha tehevi achraya. And you know what? Here's an extra one just in case something bad happens to the first one. And so as a result, you would be able to say that. So lo tzrika de amre harezo. So as a result, the Rebbe Chia's statement about when you have a mixed up toda with a tamura and there's no solution, it is a situation where you say harezu toda, where you point to Bessie and you say Bessie is going to be the toda. In that situation where you have Bessie as a toda, and then you try to switch it to I don't know, another
The daisy.
to Daisy. Great, I love it. You try to switch it to Daisy, and now both of them are considered like a toda, except that Daisy is the tamura, and one of them dies, but they were identical twins, and so you don't know which is which. So now there's nothing that you could do. And so now the Gemara is going to
What happens? What happens then? That you have two of them. What do you do then?
that you're going to have to essentially the animal is going to be left to die. There's
Which
nothing.
one?
whatever's left, whichever one is left, you can't do anything with it. We're going to see
Oh,
that
so
there's
you're allowed to pick either one. Is that it?
no, one of them died. So we don't know whether it's Bessie or Daisy that survived. So we don't know whether this is an animal that is supposed to be brought with 40 loaves, if it was Bessie, or it's an animal that's supposed to not be brought with 40 loaves, if it was Daisy.
Uh,
If we knew which one died, well, then we would know what to do. But if we don't know which one died, there's no obligation on you to bring an offering in replacement because it was a hare zu case, not a hare alai case, and so as a result, the animal is going to be forced to just die. There's nothing that could be done, and so we're going to now begin a series of 8 different efforts to try and do it. So I was going to do the first one tonight, but you know what? We don't need to. We'll do the first one, God willing, tomorrow. We'll pick up with that, God willing, tomorrow. So we'll pick up with the first suggestion tomorrow. But I do want to highlight the amazing Daf Yomi coincidence because what was the language that we said that we're going to actually use that language tonight? We said halakma. So that is, of course, not identical, but it's very similar to the halakma anya language that we're going to use tonight. So I could not help but mention, make sure that we got that far today, to make sure that we noted the fact that we're going to use that language over the course of tomorrow as well. And so we go from the halakma with respect to the Toda to the halakmanya that we will be raising, God willing, tonight at our Pesach Seders. And so I wish you all a Chag Kasher v'Sameach. We'll meet, God willing, tomorrow and Thursday and Friday, at 6 p.m., an hour before Mincha each day in the lobby at HIR. Looking forward to continuing our learning. And then next week, though, classes for Wednesday and Thursday, God willing, will be recorded by me ahead of time. I don't know exactly when they'll get posted, but they'll be recorded by me ahead of time. Wishing you a Chag Kasher.
he can't bring once the two of them. He can't, then can he bring a third one?
Well, we are going to have 8 cases. This
Oh,
is a great cliffhanger for you, Kenneth. That we're going to have 8 efforts to try and say, well, maybe you should be able to say this, or maybe you should be able to say that. And we're going to begin, of course, with the thing that we just said. What if a person were to say, fine, let me bring another one, and we'll say, if this animal is the tamura, so my new animal and the new bread is going to be the toda. And if it's the toda, well, then this will be the bread, and let me bring the other one as a guarantee. So why doesn't that work? So we are going to see that very, very shortly. But again, God willing, that will be how we will begin tomorrow with 8 different efforts to try and say, let's make it work. Let's somehow enable this Toda to be offered. And in the end, we're going to
I mean
say
a
that,
third one. You're saying a third one.
well, but right now we're trying to bring, no, remember, we have two, no, right now, again, we had
One
Bessie and
died. We don't
Daisy.
know which one died.
We
So no,
don't
the
know which
second,
one died. The
so the
question
second
is,
one you can't use it.
well, what we're trying to do is figure out a way that we could use the
Oh,
second
okay.
one.
All right.
That's the point. We're trying to say, how can we somehow get away with using the second
Oh, I
one?
thought you were saying that it's a given. We can't use it. You have to put it. You
No,
have
no,
to.
no. Well, that's what Rabbi Chia said. That's what the Brisa said in the name of Rabbi Chia. That the Brisa says that you can use it. But we're going to try 8 times to say no. Maybe Rabbi Chia is wrong.
Oh,
Maybe
okay.
there's a way to use it, and we're going to end up saying again. We're going to try 8 times, but we won't be successful. Now, technically, you'll see that we will be partially successful, but we're going to end up saying that we don't do it. And that will interestingly
But
raise
I'm
its
thinking,
own
what would
case.
Rav Chia say when this case, according to where we are now? I, I mean, I'm thinking maybe he would say bring a third one.
No, well, remember, this is a case of harezu in the end, and so as a result, you have no obligation. You
Okay.
have no further obligation. The owner of the animal has no further obligation. Will not be required to do anything. The question is what happens to the animal, and it seems like the animal is
Um,
essentially left to die.
but he
You know,
wanted to do. He wanted to bring a Toda for
he
something.
wanted to bring a toad. Correct,
So
correct.
if he
But
wanted to,
if he wants
why?
to, he can bring a new toad.
Right.
Absolutely.
That's so. I would think, according to Rav Chia, he doesn't like him allow him to bring this or this. One is dead. The other one he can't. He says, no, you can't bring it. So the man could say, okay, I'll go find another one. I want to bring a Toda.
He can do that, but he's not obligated to do that.
Right,
And-
okay.
yeah.
He wasn't
Okay.
obligated to bring the first one.
That's correct. But sometimes, right, if you say Hare alai, even though you weren't obligated to bring the first one, now you are obligated to bring one and you would be obligated to find a replacement. So it depends, again, it all depends on the language that is used. Here he's used the language of Hare zu, and so as a result, he's not obligated to bring a replacement.
Well, Are Allah, he's obligating himself, isn't he, in some measure?
Correct. That's exactly right. That's my point.
So he wasn't obligated to bring that animal, but he's obligated to bring some animal.
Now, once you say Hare alai, so then you're obligated to bring some animal.
Right.
Exactly. All
Okay.
right. We
All
will
right.
pick up, God willing, from there. We'll pick up with the first of the eight challenges to Rabbi Chia, and maybe we can get this animal to survive, to be offered. But we'll see that in fact none of them work. But we will find that out, God willing, tomorrow. Wishing everybody again a Chag Kasher v'Sameach. Looking forward to continuing our learning together.